Welcome. This is breaking news. I had a chance to sit down with SG Anon, who's incredibly busy, incredibly in demand on his own podcast and as a guest on many other popular platforms. But I've got him here today for me and for you. Thank you, SG Anon, for being here.
Thank you for having me back, John Michael. It's good to be here.
All right, let's jump into it. With two broad, so our audience knows where we're going. There's so much going on. There's two broad topics I would like SG to weigh in on. Pardon me, folks, on this broadcast. We're going to begin with Venezuela. Allow me to set it up, please. There are so many angles with which to discuss this event. And in my opinion, what a great way to kick off the new year. But we can begin with this, SG, the constitutionality and the legality of our commander-in-chief's actions. It's being challenged, of course, by the mainstream news and by the left, but also within segments of the MAGA and America First movement, wondering, has Trump taken on the role of a dictator? President Trump, is he a war criminal? Is he acting without mandate from Congress? Is he violating international law? Is he violating the Constitution? I'd like to begin there, and we're going to peel down a few more layers as we get into Venezuela. Please comment on that aspect first, if you will, please.
Well, I appreciate you opening the segment with that, John Michael, because this is one of the major issues that I have witnessed a great deal of what we would call the MAGA movement, the America First base, the broad American patriot appeal, sort of reflecting inward on itself and trying to understand, is this legal? Is it not legal? We've seen a lot of popped off rhetoric from, obviously from the left, but even from some in the right that I wouldn't characterize them as black-pilled. I would just characterize them as perhaps extremely confused about how this can be allowed to progress in the sequence and in the way sequentially internationally that it has been. And when we look at the architecture that has been used by the Trump administration since 2017 to go after those entities, organizations, and persons all around the planet that have been hostile to not only the American way of life and the American people, but the entirety of the world, they have utilized all aspects of a legal framework in existence for a number of decades. And the best example of that actually is not the current activities that are going on. I'll get into this in just a second, but it is a document called EO 13224. This is a 24-year-long executive order, presidential emergency declared by George W. Bush Jr. during the 43rd administration in response to the events of 9/11/2001. This order was issued, I believe it was 9/23/2001. And what it does is it leverages the War Powers Resolution, the congressional authorization for use of military force that was issued on 9/18/2001, so just 5 days prior to this. And we'll come back to that document here in just a second, John. And it also relied upon the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And what it allowed for the president to do was essentially to designate anyone as a sponsor of or a backer of or in league with terrorism against the United States of America. Obviously, you would have to have documentation to prove that. But if the president essentially was empowered to, designate anyone that met those descriptions by that particular label and identifier, and he could then use the entire power of the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. government to go after the financial components and any financial intersections that individual entity, group, person, organization may have had with others. And so when we look at the authorization for use of military force that was issued 5 days prior to that, the two of them dovetail together to give the commander-in-chief of the United States of America almost dictator-like powers when you look at both the ability to deploy the U.S. military in response to terrorism related to the attacks on the United States from September 11th, 2001, and that's used in the language of the congressional authorization, along with this other executive order that is 24 years in the making and continued just in 2024 and 2025, I believe, under the present administrations, the last two administrations, excuse me. So as we look at what's happening right now, John, the legality and the constitutionality is baked into the pie. It has been there for decades, quite literally. the authorization for use of military force that ties back to 9/18/2001 was incredibly vague, hyper general, and allowed for the president to basically act as a unilateral military authority when terrorism was involved that was in any way related to, connected to, benefited from, 1 degree shy of these types of things, back to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. And I forget the exact language on that part, but the language is extremely general. It's like anybody related to or having association with those parties that, committed those attacks on 9/11. And so fasting forward from that, I'm trying to paint a very broad picture here with a stroke for the audience. Fasting forward from that, what have we seen happen all around the planet? Well, the very terrorism activities that contributed to 9/11 2001 actually, apart from the mainstream narrative, but the actual activities that contributed to that terroristic event happening have expanded dramatically and increased dramatically in their complexity. They've not been woven down by these various war efforts undertaken by the U.S. military and coalition forces over the last 24 to 25 years. And so in the present day and time, John, we now have a commander in chief in the form of President Trump going all the way back to 2017, but certainly in the present day and time, we have a commander in chief who is willing to leverage these legal authorities that have been shelved in the background, but had their light switches kept on, to keep with the metaphor, and actually pull those down from the shelf and use them for what they're supposed to be used for, which is to destroy the activities of any organization, individual, person, entity, association, etc., that is doing harm to the United States in the form of terrorism that can in any way be tied back to the terrorism of 9/11 2001. And so when we look at President Trump's constitutionality here, he's well within the lines. And really this should spawn off, I think, a very significant discussion amongst the entirety of we the people here in the United States of America with respect to how long we want to allow for a blanket authorization for use of military force coming from the U.S. Congress, because that is a constitutional issue. We do have to restore the ability for the people's house to be the house that decides to take the country to war or not. But at the same time, John, and this is only my opinion on the matter, I think we should also have the discussion about how long such a declaration should be able to stay in effect if no clear end is determined.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's one of the reasons I'm happy to have you here, because I've just learned something. Did you say 13224? Is that the EO back in George Bush's day? Is that the executive order?
Indeed.
Yeah. First time this is being brought to my attention, and it makes all the sense in the world. And to our audience, you got to realize that the president, the commander in chief, has a team of legal lawyers and scholars and constitutional experts surrounding him. In addition, of course, that before anything gets deployed, he's doing everything legally and constitutionally as you just laid out. And it leads me to, am I mixing these things up a bit if I invoke executive order? I forget if it's 13818 or 13848, but the one where he can seize assets and properties of individuals under certain circumstances. Does this in some way also apply in addition to 13224, or is that a separate matter for other people like Michael Dell or Bill Gates or something?
Well, it's interesting. The situations laid out in these various executive orders, some of them are mutually exclusive, some of them are actually mutually inclusive, and there's some layering of authorities that happens through this bureaucratic process. If you picture like, making a some sort of a pastry dough, you have various component ingredients that go in together, and as you add the ingredients one at a time on top of the prior ones, the entirety of the mixture changes fundamentally. The outcome changes, the process from the beginning to the end changes. Everything is sort of augmented with the addition of each individual and an additional layer. And so looking at what's happening right now, I think that you have the authorities that are vested in 13224 that have been on display really since the earliest days of the Trump administration with EO 13818. I'm pretty sure in 13818, he even references 13224 as a basis for the authorities contained within. I know that it was referenced with respect to the 13848 emergency order issued 9/12/2018. It's stated very plainly in the order, and it was also referenced in one of the orders immediately after the events of March of 2020. I believe this order was issued in April or early May, and it dealt with It included the Stafford Act and a couple of pretty significant national emergency declarations as well. Also relying on that same International Economic Emergency Powers Act and that prior still in existence authority based on that emergency condition having never been adjudicated, right? It's sort of like we opened the doorway to these emergency powers on 9/23/2001, really 5 days before from the Congress, but then the president on 9/23/2001, and we never closed that door.
Hmm.
And so now what we have is you have a number of entities all around the planet who, if they didn't get caught in one part of the web, they got stuck in another portion of the web, and several of them are caught in multiple different directions inside the web. And I think that's what you're seeing right now and have been seeing for several years to this point is the realignment of the entities that were snared in the web at some point along the way and got a knock at the door that said, hey, things aren't looking so good for you, but there's a way that we can make things right. Why don't we work together to free for lack of a better expression here, John, I don't mean to sound pie in the sky, but to free humanity from these shackles and chains rather than continuing to take the knives to one another's throats. And I
Hmm.
think that's the approach that's been taken with most of the individuals, including organizations and entire corporation entities that have been ensnared in some of these proceedings. I think you're seeing that right now with what's going on in Venezuela. Smartmatic is obviously going to come into relevance here, but so are all of the dozens of non-governmental organizations that are on the ground in Venezuela, a number of them connected to U.S. nonprofits that have been facilitating all sorts of, not necessarily bona fide illegal activities, but certainly morally bereft and totally unethical activities. They're on the ground in South America and then importing a great deal of that into the United States, and in many cases importing the labor force as well.
Well said. I want to touch on one more aspect, and this can be a real quick drive-by piece, and before we get into some red meat. You know, we've questioned some of the things we've seen. I mean, President Trump has done this how many times? Central casting, right? He's mentioned that word hundreds of times and indicated specific people and specific events. With that in mind, some events that we've questioned, such as the Charlie Kirk anomalies and the Butler anomalies and many other, the whole 4 years of Biden, for example. So, with that in mind, while this is part of the pardon me, folks, part of the operation, the Venezuela operation. And for those folks that are worried about the constitutionality, we just covered that. Put your seatbelt on because this is the first country. But before we get into that, here's where I'm going, SG. When we're thinking about the script, while this is part of the operation, I, for one, have seen some oddities concerning the events of Maduro, different clothing in span of different hours, different stage setting, different. It just seemed a little bit contrived. Is this too, in some way or fashion, part of the script? Perhaps happened already, or some aspects of it, or am I just reading into that a little bit too much?
Well, I don't think that you're reading too deeply into the situation. I think we always have to make the allowance for the organic progression of events. Even in a staged theatrical environment, there is still the wild card unpredictability of someone forgetting their lines, someone tripping in an area on stage, forgetting their blocking. And so there is this sort of organic progression that is unavoidable and will always happen in the course of human events. But when we look over the last 5 years, President Maduro has been photographed not once but twice holding a very interesting red folder in the exact same shade, tone, vivid imagery sort of format as all of the other red folder photographs that have been taken amongst key players in what we would call a broader worldwide realignment effort. And there's an entity online called Q, and that's all that I'm going to say on it with respect to your audience. They can go and find that entity online if they're curious about it, that talks extensively about this worldwide realignment being a very purposeful and intentional maneuver on behalf of all sorts of interested parties across most of the developed world and even some of the developing world that really wanted to see their cultures thrive and not walked down the aisle with this globalist situation, having no control over their own destiny or future. And so when we look at what's happening with Maduro and Trump, and one of the reasons that I think you're not reading too far into this is because of the oddities that came immediately afterward, almost even like during and then immediately after this whole process,
Mhm.
I think that we have an example, John, of an irregular warfare maneuver playing out in real time. And let me lay out the basis really quickly for your audience why I believe that. If you look at the history of South America and Venezuela in particular over the last 40 to 55 years or so, in other words, going all of the way back to at least 1970, you can make the case with the CIA in particular that some of that overlap goes back to 1957, 58, and 59 when they were conducting operations in Paraguay and not even informing the Paraguayan government that they were on the ground there. But at least for the last 50 years, there has been this tremendous intelligence community presence inside South America. The intelligence community shadow state underpinned and backboned most of the military juntas that came to power in South America across the last half of the 20th century. And the reason for that was because all of those juntas brought certain resources and certain capital, both illegal and legal, to the worldwide market stage that the intelligence community could get their paws in first as long as they had control of those background operations. And so those dynamics over time produced reflective and impressive, truly impressive suffering on the ground for the ordinary South American person across all of their different countries continent wide, including Argentina, including Chile, Brazil, all of them. And so now you have this situation that has been created in Venezuela, sort of a microcosm of that broader continental problem that I was just talking about. And it has been going on in its modern form for at least the last 25 to 30 years. And in that period of time, you've seen a dramatic destabilization effort occur inside of Venezuela, which also resulted in dramatic destabilization, excuse me, around the rest of the continent after literally decades of pillaging these areas. And so inside Venezuela, then, you have a concentrated shadow state power structure in the background that has been in charge of Caracas basically since around 1997, 1999 timeframe. Certainly in the Chavez and Chavista era, it has been totally overrun by the intel community, and that is carried through in league with the cartels. Right? It's sort of like one layer of plausible deniability. You don't commit the crime yourself, but you have your best friend or your neighbor or some interested party to help you, assist in that particular effort, and that's been the model that's been deployed there for a long time. So, is it possible then? I paint that scenario for the audience to now ask this question: is it possible that someone with intimate knowledge of the operations of that community and shadow state structure, who has clearly been involved in human rights issues and is going to have problems on his hands no matter what when it comes to the Venezuelan people and the popular opinion of the world, who also is aware of dramatic and outcome determinative voter fraud being exported from inside his country to around the rest of the planet, including the largest superpower on earth, would that individual have valuable information in a broader law enforcement effort hemisphere wide? And when we say hemisphere wide, we're talking about military and civilian domain being blended in response to these various national emergencies related back to terrorism that we covered in that segment just a moment ago. And I submit to you that the answer to that is yes, this individual would have a dramatic amount to offer, but getting that individual in front of microphones that are friendly to that cause or in front of an office desk that can actually do something with that information is the problem. Because the moment this individual tries to get out from underneath the thumb, the real shadow state controllers, the real puppeteers, the real masters that drive the Venezuelan government and by extension the entirety of the illicit activities on the ground in Venezuela, they would absolutely crush that individual before he was able to get out of the country. And we know that, John, now through retroactive admission, because Cuba issued a statement of solidarity for not one or two or three or five or six, but 32 militants that were killed in the operation, quote unquote, defending President Maduro. Now, Cuba has been the base of operations, the forward deployed base of operations for the Cuban mafia since at least the 1960s in the immediate days post Castro's rise to power. And that forward deployed base has been used as a strong arm for most of Latin America through their brutality, through their exportation of foot soldiers that are willing to do, the really, really dirty things to keep people in line. So I don't doubt for a second that if Maduro was going to be able to offer anything of value privately to U.S. authorities or any authority of any consequence around the world, it had to be an extraction operation. This was a rescue mission, in my opinion, and I think President Maduro basically told us that in the immediate hours followed. Not only does he change clothes like 2 or 3 times while under military guard, supposedly in a brig, riding back to the United States of America. But one of the changes of clothes is a Tiffany-blue sweatshirt. And then we see custody photos released after he arrives stateside in the United States of America, where he's seated, flanked by agents on both sides, I think FBI and DEA, and he has two thumbs up, John. And
Yeah.
then the perp walk that we saw immediately after that, he says Merry Christmas under his breath, and he's wearing a giant Mickey Mouse hat. And he's changed yet again in that particular walk. So I want to ask an obvious question here. If this were an organic situation, if this actually was the abduction of a foreign head of state, why on God's green earth would that foreign head of state use his only and very limited time in front of a public video camera to support the operation with two thumbs up? Why would he say Merry Christmas? Where is the Viva la Revolucion? Where is the fight the conquistador? Where is the take up arms and remember my name? None of that pomp and circumstance. And so this tells me that there is far, far more at play. And I'll close this segment with this particular note, John. In the hours that followed the announcement of this successful military operation, President Trump completely ignited Truth Social with videos of 2020 election fraud.
That's a fascinating analysis. Thank you for getting that on the record here. There certainly is more to this than meets the eye. And it brings me to Patrick Byrne. I interviewed Patrick Byrne on another broadcast I have called Conversations of Consequence. And a couple of months back, and he broke something. I forgot particularly what it was, but it was pertaining to activities in Venezuela on that broadcast. And then later on, went on with great reporting from Emerald Robinson at Lindell TV, where Byrne unloaded a lot of stuff. But so just you sort of touched on this, but what are some of the benefits and revelations that we're beginning to unpack and the value that we're going to get out of this move in Venezuela? Obviously, you've alluded to the election theft, the Smartmatic Dominion, of which was deployed not only against us, I understand, in other nations from Venezuela. Uh, there's the issue of oil, the issue of silver. There's a lot of aspects to this. What benefits and revelations could you bullet point that we're going to gain from this operation?
It's almost hard to qualify that in a way that is holistic because the benefits are so multi-angular. It's really enormous. I think the most immediate benefit is we destabilize the black market syndicate network operations inside the Western Hemisphere. A great deal of that is not originating in South America as its point of origin comes into the Western Hemisphere first into South or very, very southern portions of Central America. In other words, South America is a collection zone for all sorts of, higgledy-piggledy that gets exported all around the world after it's collected. Sort of like you fly a lot of flights into a particular large, airport that has a great hub, a big runway is centrally located so that you can redirect them, to their final destination. And so looking at that, just that in and of itself dramatically improves national security for every single country inside the Western Hemisphere. That should not be overlooked. This is a massive, massive win for disappointing that shadow state structure in other junctions and other nodes around the world. And I want to talk about it in those terms. It's not disappointing to Beijing when we talk about Beijing, I'm talking about Xi and the Communist Party as two separate entities. It's not disappointing to one part of Beijing to have something like this happen because they already have designs on other things that are closer to them in their area of the world, such as Taiwan. But it is extremely disruptive to any sort of dark money operations, resource kidnapping operations, or thieving operations going on in the background, anything pertaining to organized movements of bona fide criminal activities like slavery, for example. Anybody that's involved in that, and I can tell you the Beijing intelligence community and secret security services have been involved in that for a long time, they're going to be significantly impacted by something like this. And now they have to re-examine movement pathways. They have to re-examine how they communicate with certain areas of the world, certain other junction nodes that are out there. The same is true with the oligarchy that exists in the background inside Russia and their involvement inside fleecing the Venezuelan countryside for all sorts of earth minerals and oil. That's been going on for a while now. So these entities are dramatically interrupted when something like this occurs. Outside of that, I think the biggest victory overall, not to outshine what we're talking about securing the hemisphere, but I think the biggest immediate victory for the humanitarian side is going to be the ability to introduce Venezuelan resources back into the economy in such a fashion that it will force a revaluation of the bolivar. And I think when that occurs, John, you're going to see not only reverberations in worldwide markets, but you will see a dramatic, meteoric, and extremely rapid reascent in quality of living and quality of life inside of Venezuela. Venezuela is a beautiful place. I've never been, but I have actually a couple of personal friends in my life who I've made along the way who are from there. Phenomenal people, extremely well educated. Their English is just as good as mine. And they have talked, and showed me photos, and I've been sort of in an extracurricular way. This area of the world's almost like dear to my heart in a fashion, and so to see it sort of coming back in the fashion that it can, the potential that is being unlocked right now for economic reascent and reacclimation, or excuse me, reclamation in this process. I think that is going to dramatically reverberate, not just in world markets from a revaluation standpoint, but right there kinetically on the ground inside South America. I think you'll see cross-border trade increasing, especially with Brazil and Argentina. I think once the situation is figured out in Colombia, you will also see a lot of cross-border economic activity happening there. And so this is an opportunity to reignite the potential of one of the most well endowed and reflective of God's perfect natural design, right? The South American rainforest and things like that. This is the chance to reignite that area of the world, I think, in a dramatic way.
And it's long overdue. And that brings us to some other countries. You mentioned earlier on about the constitutionality, the executive orders that affords the president under these executive orders to do what he's doing. He's not done, as I see it. There's a lot of chatter about Cuba, Iran, Europe itself, the EU, let's say, Greenland, Colombia, Canada. Any country, if you want to comment on these or others briefly, because President Trump, as I see it, is the supreme commander in chief of the global defense allies, restructuring the landscape of the world for the better, clearly. So he's not finished yet. I see rumblings in Cuba, Iran, EU, Greenland, Colombia, maybe other places. Do you care to comment on what may be to come to prepare our viewers for some great disruptive changes, similar in some cases to what took place in Venezuela, and other countries it may not be a war move like that, but it may be another strategic move. What do you see happening with some of these countries, and would you agree that the president's just getting started on this?
I would agree with that, but I would even characterize it a step further. I think the president began this entire process when he started talking about having Canada as the 51st state. I think
Mhm.
that was the opening salvo towards worldwide rebalancing of security and operational economic zones. And when we talk about rebalancing, what we're really talking about is designing for the first time in the present format, because we have never had the opportunity as a worldwide we the people to align our economic systems in a fair, just, and standardized way all around the planet without tortuous outside interference. And that is a huge underpinning to why we have to have this security blanket added to that discussion, right, John? If we're going to move economy, resources, international commerce channels and pathways, accepted ancestral and generational trade routes, if we're going to readjust and realign a great deal of that, and ostensibly we're going to try and do that, taking the fiat out of the equation to bring as much real, actual value back to the wealth and treasure of mankind as we can, then we absolutely cannot have evil continuing to profiteer within inside that system, because the profit gradients would increase dramatically by orders of magnitudes, to the detriment of society. And so in the Western Hemisphere, we have had, again, this rogue intelligence community. And now I'm going to get just a little bit weird with your audience out there. I am one of those individuals, after having read some of the CIA's own declassified archives that the audience can go out there and read for themselves if they like, who feels that not only are we securing the Western Hemisphere and the world from certain types of terrorism that are underpinned by terrestrial forces, but I also believe that, especially since the Roswell incident of the 20th century, we have had to contend with unusual threats of an extraordinary or outside of terrestrial understandings and terrestrial norms in nature. And a lot of that in my research, John, seems to be suggestive that a lot of that is located within and around the Arctic Circle and various points of the Arctic around the world. It's one of the reasons I believe Russia has moved so rapidly to militarize certain parts of their Siberian Arctic, even laying claim to certain territories that had never been prior claimed by Russia or powers that came even prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, in the era where steam power was just really getting underway in the icebreaker sense. So as we look at the Arctic, Greenland, the situation with Canada, I think, is completely fluid. I would expect those two areas in particular to be a focus of President Trump's national security interests because of that expanded and unusual premise, but also because the exploratory potential of the Arctic, the resources that the Arctic may provide the planet. We really don't fully know what the Arctic Ocean has to offer this world, and the few organizations and powers that do know certainly have not shared that information. I think that the tools for that sort of discussion as it pertains to the Arctic component and the dealings with Europe are going to be much more on the financial side, the economic side. We're sort of going to throw our weight around the room with how much economy and power we can bring to the equation, how much prosperity we can offer the Canadian people, how much prosperity we can offer the Greenlanders and the indigenous tribes that are in Greenland, those types of things, as it pertains to securing other areas of the hemisphere that still have yet to be dealt with. And it's worth noting that Venezuela is not over yet, right? This is just the start of a longer process that hopefully will not turn into a multi-year drag out, but certainly does need some time to gestate and settle. As we look at other candidates for, the game board, I think Colombia is on the menu without question because of President Trump's own rhetoric and his own comments immediately following Venezuela. As of today, with President Trump's interview on Hannity, I would also say that Mexico is now on the list for potential kinetic involvement with the U.S. military forces because of the inability of the civilian apparatus inside these countries, both of these countries, to respond to the intelligence community originated warlord construct that exists there now. And I want to highlight for the audience really quick, John, that intelligence community construct is not a bunch of contractors down there taking up arms and getting in AK-47s and dressing up and stuff. It's a bunch of contractors who have convinced a great many of the local population to do exactly that over a period of several decades. And so now what you have are incredibly complex paramilitary conditions inside those two nations specifically, and as well as Panama, although Panama has gotten a much better handle on it in recent years. But those two nations, specifically Colombia and Mexico, it is virtually impossible for authentic rule of the people and authorities that are aligned with that sect of the population to fight back and wrest control away from these paramilitarized forces. So I would expect to see U.S. military intervention simply on that basis alone as we go forward in the weeks and months to progress. And I would expect the negotiations about this Greenland idea, Canada, the securing of the Arctic, resource exchange with Russia, this peace tunnel that was broached by certain Russian envoys not that long ago about the Bering Strait, potentially, bringing the Bering Strait to a bridge situation. I would expect all of this, John, to happen pretty much concurrently on the world stage.
Wow. So much restructuring on so many levels across this world, and this year and the next coming years are going to really change the landscape of everything here. And that leads me to the economy. The London Exchange and the central bank has controlled and manipulated the gold and silver markets for decades. This is now coming to an end as I see it, with what's been going on behind the scenes, with the massive demand for silver, with the empty vaults in London, the central bank day by day as their trading schemes, their naked shorts, their futures contracts come due, and they don't have the silver to make good on it. They're going to the lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve window. And that is not a good situation. I'm not following it that closely. Last time I checked, it's over 50 something billion collective dollars. I know Bank of America and Citibank were, I mean, I'll just say it's basically out of business for a brief period of time until that money was procured. So we have a major event taking place there that I see as good news for us and bad news for the central bank game that's been run on us and the world for decades. The short selling manipulation has caught them finally on the wrong side of the trade. And last I checked, as I said, it was 51 billion. It's probably a whole lot more than that now that they've been borrowing, which of course is digital printed, digital fiat injected in, which can't be good for the dollar, but good for them. But they can't kick the can down the road. In the next 90 days, I understand a lot of these futures contracts are coming due to billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know what the way out is or what scheme they can come up with to keep this game going. So, what's your take on that? Silver is in demand. Silver, China's locked the doors on silver. They're not letting it out of the country. They got a lot of it. What's your take on that whole package? Because this is pretty important. Money, sound money, restoring sound elections, and then exporting that throughout the rest of the world over time. And of course, rescuing and rehabilitating the children, one might say, are will end up being the three legacies of Donald Trump. But we're in the process of getting there. What's your comment on what you see taking place in the central bank implosion because they are imploding behind the scenes?
Well, it's truly impressive and amazing to watch, John, I have to say. And I think my comments on this issue would be that for the first time ever in recorded history that we are aware of, perhaps with extremely limited exception around the time that the American Revolution was first pulled off, and around the time that King Edward actually evicted certain financial sects out of, I think it was the Scottish kingdoms, and that's been literally hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But really, for the first time, and certainly for the first time worldwide, we have the ability, as we the people, to ensnare the banksters, the fraudsters, the gangsters in the exact same scheme that they've been playing off of with us the entire time. As we look at the derivative shorts that you were talking about, the short trades against silver that you were referencing just a moment ago, the actual trades themselves are in the tens of billions, dollar for dollar a figure. But derivative and option shorts that exist within inside these large banking institutions inside the Western world are literally in the hundreds of billions of dollars, far exceeding any of the reserves that any of these financial institutions could ever hope to bring to bear forward if they actually had to, if there was actually an insolvency crisis that occurred and those debts came due. And up until recent years, really from 1933 to the present time, just in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we had a period of time in the United States of America where disrupting the fundamental mechanism holding all of that together, essentially the Federal Reserve fiat debt currency system as a form of heir to print style money, that entire system could not be disrupted because we, the people, did not have access to true industrial scale retail investing in the spaces that would disrupt those types of economic systems, right? FDR outlawed gold and silver, if I'm not mistaken. I know Nixon moved us off of the international gold standard. There was a great devaluation of silver coinage throughout the last half of the 20th century. I forget what the percentages got down to. I think the quarter was like 25% silver by the time it was all said and done. It used to be 100%. All of our coinage used to be actual metal. And so as we look at what's happening now in the present day and time, the demand for silver in particular, but also all of these other components of technological advancement, palladium, platinum, cobalt, manganese, tungsten, all of these different arenas inside the precious metal space, that drives this this countercart, for lack of a better expression for it, against this fiat debt system that was put in place over us a very long time ago. And combining that with the actual disruption of the supply chains themselves worldwide, which did not used to be possible, because if you disrupted our supply here in the West, we would simply come in and Saddam Hussein you. Now that that has become a real world reality, it simply is impossible for the Western world financial structure to continue to hold down the actual valuation, not just of the silver market or the precious metals market, but the entirety of the tangibles asset economic space worldwide. We have had a situation where the central banks basically had a soft ownership power in over 200 countries by the time it was all said and done in the early 2000s. And so, if there was a resource that the central banks and the entities loyal to and connected to the central banks in the West wanted for themselves, all they had to do was push a few buttons on a keyboard or print a few extra pieces of paper to send out to decision makers and talking heads inside government, inside various government agencies that were doing things like accounting, auditing, money printing, fiscal policy for the nation, etc. And they could have those resources revalued literally in a week or two. And yes, it disrupted worldwide markets. It expanded incredible amounts of poverty. It exported chaos all around the planet. But that was not the concern. The concern was, how can we get what we want, hang on to it on our side of the fence, and ensure that we, the people populations of planet Earth, do not have access to them. Now, that system has been completely disrupted because all of the different doors, there's 200 doors now that have been shut. And so as you look at what's going on, each individual room or country in this metaphor has had the opportunity, since the first Trump administration came to power and started disrupting the system between 2017 and 2020, to begin an internal assessment of what they actually have on the ground. This is another important byproduct, going back to Venezuela, that comes from that, right? We have no idea what the actual value of their natural and national resources really is, because we've not had honest figures for at least the last 2 decades. In some countries in Africa, John, we've never had honest figures of what they actually have in the ground, in the ore, with respect to their natural resources, with respect to their climatic resources, with respect to their currency-backed resources, all of these sorts of things. There's some countries around the world that there's never been an honest reflection and honest accounting and an evaluation ever truly done. And so now we're living in a time where that process has been playing out for a number of years, and now it's becoming more public. Now we're seeing a great deal of the large mass population space, and we're talking about organizational players, institutional players, high impact retail players, high volume retail players, that are beginning to catch on to the fact that the tangibles asset space, to include silver, precious metals, and all these other valuation mechanisms, will eventually right the boat, and it's better to get on the boat earlier rather than later.
With the with all that being said, and the handcuffs, as I see it, coming off of the control mechanisms, if you will, that the central bank and the rest of them have been using against gold and silver, as well as many other things, we've seen, and you and I talked about this a few months ago, we certainly see it escalating, and that's of course straight from the president himself, Scott Bessent, from Dan Scavino. If people want sources, looks like we're heading towards no federal income tax, a complete restructure, if not done away with, the Federal Reserve, as well as its a little cousin called the Internal Revenue Service. I see these entities as coming to an end, perhaps sooner than we think. Quick comment on that. Would you concur, or would you just say it's going to be restructured to serve the people, or will it by and large be done away with?
I think the ultimate outcome will be a complete displacement and replacement of the banking model. But I view that as, still a few years down the road, because there's a lot of ground to sort of cover between now and then. I
Mhm.
think for the immediate term, what we see on that issue is a restructuring, potentially even a renaming, to add a new mission or a new purpose to these entities, right? Some of what we've seen around the planet happening since the first Trump administration almost suggests like a reversal of some sorts being applied to certain areas. Space Force, for example, taking over the area of the secret space program of the Air Force, and other examples along the way. So I could absolutely see the benefit in using the infrastructure that these entities have been relying upon, that they've created over the last 100 years, to begin changing the system and inverting it. But of course, the ultimate process of that is one puts oneself out of a job.
Well, I'm going to drop a few quotes from Elon Musk here to muddy up the waters even further. And, and I don't believe they're just on a whim or an act of stupidity. I think it's precision meme dropping. Musk is, I'm paraphrasing, but almost a quote, has basically said over the last several weeks, there'll be a little bit down the road, no need to save money. And then he went on to say, a little further down the road, I'm paraphrasing, there'll be no need to work. Now, that's a big conversation to be had. And we might as well throw in the 650 airplanes of the gold that was taken back from the underground cities of the Vatican, the St. Germain Trust of 160 trillion, the trading of our birth certificate, which is a fact. I've been looking into that. I'm going to do a whole report on that. Um, uh, how much money is through the fraudulent systems have been taken from us as individuals. And President has a sovereign wealth fund that he's talked about, and the External Revenue Service has brought in about almost, what, $500 billion or something. Um, You've got 20 trillion pledged over the next several years from foreign countries here at home. We've got exploration of oil and gas. We've got AI and robotics, crypto. I mean, there's such tremendous wealth and opportunity. And then that $38 trillion of federal debt that's at the US debt clock. I've come to understand that the majority of that debt is actually not going to end up on our books, but maybe the last nail in the coffin in the bankruptcy of the 1871 Corp and the Federal Reserve's books. So as I throw all that at the dartboard and those statements from Musk and the president saying we don't need a federal income tax, and Scott Bessent saying you're going to have the biggest tax return year ever. We've got the president saying I'm going to give you a dividend around June or July. What's a dividend? In short, simple layman's definition, well, it's a profit of some sort being spun off to someone who must own something. Well, what do we own? We own our country again. What are we getting? A profit because we're wealthy. Now, all these pieces haven't fully landed into place just yet, and the dollar is going to suffer greatly per 107 and others before it gets re-strengthened with gold and other commodities en route to a QFS. To go into all that, um, there's so much. I don't even know if I want to open this up right now, but this is where, when you look at AI, yeah, when, I'm going to go there right now, and we'll wrap this up with this question because it's fascinating. Um, the way I see it, and again, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but I talk to a lot of people, and I see the dollar, it's had its worst year in a long time. I see with all this digital printing, fiat into the system to try and one last attempt to save the banking system. All of these things in the BRICS nations and so forth and so on is going to continue to drive the dollar down. And 107, who knows a thing or two about currencies, says the dollar will have a near-death experience. But then, of course, it'll be back when all the pieces settle. It'll be backed by gold and other commodities. It'll be transformed from paper into a stable coin. This is how I understand it. I'd like you to weigh in on this. To a stable coin. And then the stable coin goes into a quantum financial system, decentralized with our own wallet, encrypted by Space Force type of encryption. And all the wealth that's been stolen has been tabulated for each legal Social Security person in America. X amount of dollars. Maybe you're worth 17 million, SG. I don't know what your number is, but they do. When you look at that trajectory in this line of conversation, um, and the AI that we've come to learn about with Chat GPT and all the little fun things we do, that's like child's play for the AI that they have access to and have for some years, I would imagine. I think they can understand and read our vibration, our frequency, and that will tie into AI's functionality in our wallet, as I've just described, where there's almost no need for a bank. You are your bank, and so forth. So if we're heading in this science fiction world, which seems like we're heading there, if this is in the vicinity of accuracy, this is where God and science actually come to meet. Because if AI can read our frequencies, and if they can't just dump all the money into everybody's lap, that won't work for a host of reasons. There's got to be morals and accountability and various things that I believe AI is going to know about us on before monies get released. Am I in quackery land? Help me out here.
I have to admit, John, that's probably the best closing question to any discussion I've had in a while, because we're talking about two different concepts here and they're sort of mutually inclusive. We're talking about the spiritual maturity of mankind. At the same time, we are talking about the ability of mankind to provide for itself and its posterity long into the generational future. And these two scenarios, these two arenas of life, what we would call, like, as we walk the human journey and we come into life and we're going through life and we're learning things about life and having all of these different experiences that eventually culminate in what we would call the life experience before we have our death experience. As we do that, these two main areas are the big ones, right? Who am I spiritually, and what am I going to teach any progeny that I have about that? How am I going to perceive and conceive of myself as it pertains to something like that? And then the other side is, what do I bring to the table? What am I here for? What's my
Mhm.
calling? What am I supposed to give back? What should I have in exchange for that? What it's reasonable to expect in return for that, right? There's,
Mhm.
something for something is sort of a basic understanding of all of human existence. And so a lot of what you said a moment ago about various systems into the future remains uncorroborated, but it certainly seems reasonable when we look at the trajectory of events so far. Elon Musk is no dummy, right? This is someone who has access to extremely high levels of information. He's going, just because of his partnership with the US government vis-a-vis SpaceX, and for no other reason, I would trust his assessment on certain things as it pertains to national wealth capability, national productivity capability, what the landscape could actually look like, right? This is an individual who had this no-name electric car manufacturer, and he was working, 22 and a half hour days for a while at that manufacturer trying to get it off the ground. And now look at where it's at. And so as we look at that individual, I would read into those comments with a certain degree of encouragement and optimism. But at the same time, I would also appreciate that the forward thinking aspect of that is going to take a decent while to penetrate into the consciousness of people. That while could be months to a few years. It could be a few years to a decade, perhaps a decade and a half, or maybe it extends out to a generation. I think the pace of all of that type of rhetoric and achieving a world in alignment with that sort of an expectation, but also balanced on the individual and personal liberty side of things, it's going to be entirely dependent on us as we the people in whatever culture or country that is having this discussion nationally amongst itself. It's going to depend entirely on us and how ready we are for that. As we look at the economic world of the future, I think we have another angle that we can appreciate on this, and that is the angle of just totally objective reality and logical expectation as we go forward. If we are moving from a debt system, a fiat system, an unsecure, misoriented, inverted system, to the opposite of that, which is a corrected, balanced, trustless system based entirely on God's laws and not our willingness to, like or not like each other, or trust or not trust each other. Human beings are fickle, right? Sometimes we're happy with each other and sometimes we just don't want to talk to each other. And that's simply a matter of fact. But as we look at God's expectation and God's design in the world, it's unyielding, it's everlasting. It remains the same day to day, right? The Spirit of the Lord abides forever. And if the Spirit of the Lord is abiding forever inside of a currency landscape or an economic landscape, then it must be a landscape that is impenetrable by what we would call maligned actors or maligned forces. And
Mhm.
there's only two ways that you can do that, John. You can take every single individual out there and hold them accountable to what level of morality you think they will arise to, which is fundamentally inverted to what the New Testament and all of the Bible teaches. Or you can simply take that out of the equation entirely and encrypt a landscape or design a landscape or base a landscape upon principles and real world connectivities, both material and digital, that cannot be imbued or run off track by those sort of inverted interests, right? And so, in this present example that I'm sort of painting here, in this hypothetical, piggybacking off of Elon and off of Trump's comments as well, quantum leap in the standard of American living. He wants 10 freedom cities. This is, this was rhetoric from a while back on the
Mhm.
campaign trail, but it's still relevant, I think, in today's day and time. The only way that any of that is achievable is a spiritual maturation period that produces a high functioning human civilization where all of us are, understanding who we are in God, who we are in Christ and with one another, what our actual spiritual capabilities are, what it's supposed to be like interacting with one another, what we actually want to see happen at the end of the day instead of being caught up in the minutia of the moment. And simultaneous to that, we have to have a securing of all value exchange systems and modus operandi around the world. And I think that is exactly what we have seen. We are continuing to see, and we will continue to see more evolutions of that as we go forward into the future. You mentioned AI just a moment ago. I don't think it stops with AI. I think eventually, when this journey is over, we will have a quantum consciousness capable system, a system that can interact with us to whatever degree we permit it to, because personal liberty and personal autonomy still has to be, at the forefront. Free will is the essence of who we are as creations, here on God's world. And I think ultimately, John, that creates a system that is akin to utopia, but not in such a pie in the sky way. If we have security in our value exchange, then crime is vastly reduced and really kind of, made irrelevant and unimportant. Suffering and struggling are not known in the capacity that they would be known in a system where the value exchange is unsecure or insecure and very vulnerable to being hacked or maligned. And other things downstream of that, we could spend an entire podcast talking on it. So I think this entire transformation that we're witnessing, we're in the throes of it, we're in the middle of it. It's not going to be over with 2026 or 2028, but I think as we go forward each month, each year successively, and I don't think it's going to take very long, John, we're going to arrive at a world that honestly looks like a balance between 1776 and the Jetsons.
Yeah, well said. It is a fascinating subject. I took a few notes to feedback and we'll close out. But so there's a lot more to QFS than the speed of particle flow and money flow, as we can see. It's it's contributing in a lot of different ways as you just laid out. I think of the term ascension, 3D, 4D, and 5D. These are interesting things to explore at another time. We are all, many of us, ascending, and some of us rather rapidly, into higher states of consciousness. And I think that is very, very important. And I think that we can certainly have a debate in the future, and I'm going to be doing a lot more of these type of talks later once we get past our dangers on the streets of America, which is going to get worse before it gets better, till some of the immediate issues get resolved. And when that happens, and we're standing on top of the hill, in a safer place. Meanwhile, all this other stuff's being worked on. I'm going to be talking a whole lot more about this and learning a lot about it. And I sure wish that Cyrus A. Parsa was still with us. This was a man I think was murdered, but he had quite a bit to say about AI and all that. But it's an interesting subject, as I said, where God and technology sort of come together, keeping these QFS isn't just about the speed of money moving around. It keeps a lot of things in checks and balances, and it prevents the money laundering, prevents the gun running, prevents the child sex I mean, you can't do it. So it's an interesting transition that we're all in. And then you throw the med beds in there. We're talking about health and wealth. Heck, if we're all prospering and everything is favored in God's eyes, you've got a course correction for humanity that is moving in the right direction. And lastly, so if you've got the wealth and you can do good things for society and for others, and think of the ingenuity and the creativity of whether it's artists or tech people or industrialists or whatever, so much will come out of us that we've never had the ability to unleash because we've been in debt slaves, basically, and other things. This is extraordinary. I'm 67 years old. I'll jump into the med beds for 1 second. If we have this prosperity and this wealth, and we have this new cleaner place to inhabit on planet Earth. Then you've got med beds, which I understand are being used by military and children right now. I know one person that's been in a med bed, a doctor. Um, uh, they'll be available. Maybe we live 150 years healthy, and we've got wealth. You sit down one day, I'm talking figuratively, and ponder that, and ponder the incredible gifts that God has instilled in each and every one of us that we will be able for the first time to be able to explore. I think the world is going to be amazing. I know there's a counter narrative to this, and it's a good debate. It's a good, healthy discussion to have. I'm unwilling to devote the time to it right now because we're killing people on the streets. We're burning buildings. ICE officers are getting driven over. We've got a lot of chaos coming yet, according to the military experts I speak with. But when things settle down, we're going to jump into this new world discussion a whole lot more. And all I can do is invite everyone into the fifth dimension. It's nice. It's nice. You look around, it gets a little lonely, but you see things quite differently as you move up the Christ consciousness ladder of ascension. I'm just rambling around here. SG, why don't you close us out with something pointed for our audience? I appreciate your wisdom, your articulation, and your broad scope of knowledge. And you've raised a few things in this discussion today that I've learned quite a bit about. Just close us out. Take us anywhere you want to go.
Well, actually, I think your prior segment there and your comments you were just making sort of echo my closing thoughts for this particular broadcast. As we look at this process, John, it has to be sequential in a certain way, but not necessarily linear in nature, right? How quickly it goes, the time frame that elapses, the level of discomfort that comes along the way. I think all of that is adjustable based on the general palette of we the people and the general sequence and flow of events as things progress and people accept or don't accept certain things as they move forward in their own journey. And that's what this great awakening is all about. This is a spiritual refinement trial, if you will. It's a refinement period in the course of human destiny where God is awakening all of God's people here in the world to a number of different things, and not just the evil ones, but also the possibilities. And those concepts are almost sort of juvenile to talk about when we talk about wrapping our heads around them, because you think about the possibilities, you start thinking about playground talk from elementary and middle school. But it really is, I think, in a lot of ways about the possibilities. And if you're going to entertain gravitational possibilities for human social culture, possibilities for human quality of living, possibilities for human health, wealth, lifestyle, progeny, prosperity, security, long term into the future. We're talking about hundreds of years. The proliferation of entire family lines and lineages as we go through the future of this millennial age, this 21st, and then very soon the 22nd century, 23rd, and on down the road. In entertaining that and approaching a subject or subjects like that of that gravity requires a significant presence of mind, focus, heart, and spirit. It requires the ability to hear God's word within us, to feel Christ's words and teachings resonating within us, to understand who we are fundamentally. We have the ability to come into alignment with the Holy Spirit. We should talk more about that. This is the Holy Spirit that creates worlds. This is the Holy Spirit that birthed the universe into existence, that is responsible for the mastery of the celestial clock in the heavens, that is responsible for the balance between man and nature, and animalia and flora and fauna and nature, that is responsible for how we interact with one another and the imbuement, the animation of life, the breath of life, quite literally, of every single thing that creeps and crawls upon the world. And that includes the apex creation, the human being, all of the way down to the single celled amoeba. And when we appreciate that that is the spirit that we have access to anytime we want to, as long as we come into it with a fervent attitude, that we're humble, that we're willing to, you know, be silent and still is the way that I approach it in my own personal walk. I really take the be still and know that I am God verse very, very seriously in my own walk. And I just try to feel what that spirit is calling me and pushing me to do. And as we as humanity get more aligned in that capacity, as we refire our anatomy to have these types of experiences with God's creative spirit, as we come into the identity of who we're supposed to be. We were the regents of this world. This was always supposed to be our planet. They literally did steal it from us. And so this is a period of time where we are reclaiming that mantle. We're reclaiming that regency, but we have to be prepared for the kingship, John. And so that moves us through the period of time that we're in right now. This is the maturing period before we take the throne.
Well said. We'll close out there. SG Anon, thank you very much for taking time away from your family and doing this for me at this hour. Folks, visit jmcbroadcasting.com, and on the upper left of the navigation bar, second tab says contributors. You'll see a lot of folks there, military intelligence and economic experts. Also a way for you to connect up with SG Anon. His biography is there and a link to his world. Connect up with SG if you aren't already. There's a one-stop shop for you to get there and learn more about SG Anon. I want to thank you, sir, for your inspiration in those closing comments and for your analysis on the subjects we addressed here today. God bless you, sir. We'll rendezvous at some point in the very near future. Thank you, SG.
Sounds wonderful. God bless, John. Thank you.
Your hard-earned assets are under attack and may be in harm's way. Many people are confused, thus concerned about what is going on with the currency, the markets, and the economy. A great change is underway. With the private wealth coach consult, of which John Michael Chambers discusses in greater detail in Module 10 of the Wealth Coach University, you can break through procrastination as you become informed, empowered, and connected. JMC has created a system whereby you can avail yourself to a team of like-minded professionals to help you navigate this unprecedented minefield and meet privately with John Michael Chambers. The Wealth Coach University was launched based upon years of experience as a successful former financial advisor to help you, Goots, get out of the system.
Hello, this is John Michael Chambers. I retired after nearly 15 years as an independent financial advisor in 2008 to heed a higher calling. My biography can be accessed by visiting wealthcoachuniversity.com. I know what goes on behind the scenes in the world of Wall Street and investments, as well as having my finger on the pulse of the global financial reset of which we are presently engaged. Let's discuss the Wealth Coach Consult. I am not a financial advisor, and I do not give specific financial advice, nor can I assist you in the repositioning of your assets. I will, however, provide answers to your questions to the best of my ability and provide a high-level analysis of you and your situation. At the conclusion of our consult, if one is prepared to take the next step and begin repositioning assets to GOOTS, G-O-O-T-S, get out of the system, I will make available to you the appropriate individuals in my resource network. In the financial world, these are licensed, seasoned, patriot professionals that can assist in this area and to help you get from where you are to where you need to be as soon as possible, both confidentially and with confidence. Visit wealthcoachuniversity.com. By doing so, you gain access to the 10 free educational video PowerPoint modules. Then schedule your Wealth Coach consult with me today. I do look forward to speaking with you. It's time.